Good day, my friends. Thank you for joining me for this program at a moment when events in and around Ukraine are moving faster than many ever imagined. Behind the headlines, behind the speeches in Western capitals and the emotional sound bites on television, a very different reality is taking shape. A reality defined not by slogans, but by facts on the battlefield and hard limits on Western power. Today, I want to take you through that reality as it is, not as Washington, Brussels, or Kiev wish it to be. We will look at how the negotiations have stalled, why Ukraine's leadership refuses even minimal compromise, how Europe has trapped itself politically and economically, and why Russia now holds the initiative both militarily and diplomatically. If you stay with me to the end, you will see the war in Ukraine not as a collection of disconnected stories, but as one coherent process in which Russia's position is steadily strengthening while the Western project in Ukraine unravels. Let us begin. Russia's war in Ukraine has entered a phase where military reality, political denial, and diplomatic theater are colliding, and only one side is truly prepared for the consequences. From Washington to Kyiv to European capitals, everyone is talking about settlements and formats. But on the ground, it is Russian artillery, Russian infantry, and Russian missiles that are deciding the future of this conflict. Before turning fully to Ukraine, it is worth briefly noting what is happening around Venezuela, because it reveals a pattern. We were told that President Trump had a tough phone call with President Nicolas Maduro, that Trump demanded Maduro's resignation, that Maduro supposedly agreed to step down within a year or two, or on condition of personal guarantees and immunity for his circle. Then we were told Trump rejected all such conditions. None of this is verified. Maduro is still in power, Venezuelan officials are still at their posts, and no binding agreement has been announced. What we are really seeing is the familiar behavior of parts of the U.S. establishment, leaking stories designed to create the impression that a targeted leader is on the verge of surrender even before a shot is fired. At the same time, Washington concentrated an aircraft carrier and 7 missile destroyers near Venezuela, declared what is effectively a no-fly zone, and now seems unable to decide whether to pull the trigger or climb down. The problem for Washington is obvious. Once you mass that kind of force near a country and publicly threaten its government, it becomes extremely hard to back away without losing face. In the Venezuelan case, commercial flights are still going in and out, airlines are not behaving as if a real war is imminent, and yet the U.S. has not resolved what it wants to do. This hesitation, this gap between rhetoric and action, is exactly what we now see in even more dangerous form over Ukraine. The Florida meeting, Americans pressing, Ukrainians refusing. The core of the current drama is the failed attempt by the United States to bring Ukraine into line with a framework it previously floated to Russia. Recently, Ukrainian officials met with a U.S. delegation in Miami. The most detailed account comes from Axios. The official line from both sides was that the talks were difficult but constructive, difficult but positive. When politicians give you a menu of adjectives like that, you should choose the one that actually matters. Difficult. There is no evidence of substantive progress, as Russia would define the term. The meeting quickly became bogged down over the central territorial question, whether Ukraine should withdraw from Donbass. That dispute apparently forced the Americans to cut the format down to a smaller group, 3 on each side. On the U.S. team, the key figures were Witkoff and Kushner, close to Trump, but not formal officials. On the Ukrainian side, the chief negotiator, the chief of the general staff, and the deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, Vadim Skibitsky. The most striking detail is who was not in that room. Kyrilo Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief. He was part of the broader delegation but excluded from the inner format. That suggests a lack of trust. Budanov has been too close to the Americans for some tastes in Kyiv, and just as importantly, he has maintained a back channel to the Russians. He has met them in Abu Dhabi. We know that because the U.S. Assistant Secretary of War, Dan Driscoll, famously gatecrashed one such meeting and thereby exposed it. Budanov has also made uncomfortably pessimistic remarks about the war's trajectory, angering circles in Ukraine who prefer public fantasies to private realism. So the Americans narrowed the format, tried to apply more pressure on a smaller Ukrainian group to accept withdrawal from Donbass, and still failed. After the 3-on-3, Witkoff then held a one-on-one with the Ukrainian negotiator Umarov, clearly a last-ditch attempt to extract concessions directly. Following that private conversation, Umarov phoned Zelensky for instructions, and all indications are that Zelensky dug in his heels. He refused to accept any withdrawal from Donbass. On this crucial point, Kyiv did not move an inch. We have heard little about the second big issue, NATO membership. But reports suggest the Ukrainians were equally rigid. They reportedly agreed to explore workarounds, but absolutely refused to alter the constitutional clause committing Ukraine to joining NATO. No cosmetic scheme for freezing or delaying membership can alter that legal reality, and the Russians know it. NATO treaties, and why Moscow is not fooled. This is where the Western game collapses. Russia watches not only what Kiev says behind closed doors, but what it signs in public. A few months ago, Zelensky approved a bilateral treaty with Britain that has since been ratified by both governments. That treaty explicitly describes Ukraine as being on an irreversible path to NATO membership. The NATO Secretary General repeats the same mantra. Key European governments publicly support this line. For Moscow, this is not ambiguous. Ukrainian NATO membership remains the official entrenched goal of both Kiev and its Western patrons. If the Ukrainian constitution still commits to NATO, and if treaties with major NATO members proclaim the path irreversible, then any clever Western scheme to park the issue for a while will be dismissed in Moscow as pure trickery. Russia will insist that the core question remains unresolved and that therefore no final settlement is possible. That is exactly what will happen. An empty-handed mission to Moscow. After the Florida debacle, Witkoff and Kushner are now traveling to Moscow, apparently without Senator Rubio. His absence is telling. As Secretary of State, Rubio is the man who should be leading serious negotiations with Russia. The fact that he refuses to go to Moscow strongly suggests that he does not truly believe in this process and does not want to be seen making concessions to a country the neocon wing in Washington still dreams of defeating. That leaves Moscow with a peculiar delegation. Two men close to Trump, but neither part of the formal U.S. government. The Russians know very well who Jared Kushner is. They consider him intelligent and well-informed, and they understand that he is influential by virtue of his relationship to Trump. But he has no official role. Witkoff, a businessman with presidential authorization to talk but not to bind a state, is in the same position. Both men are outsiders. From Moscow's perspective, that raises a very obvious question. Who exactly do these people truly speak for? And how much authority do they really have? The Russians are already familiar with the script. In Alaska, months back, Trump and Putin discussed a series of points, the famous 28 points, that might form the basis of an eventual settlement. Trump assured Putin he could bring the Ukrainians and the Europeans along. Then came the August meetings in Washington, with Zelensky and a parade of European leaders in tow. Zelensky rejected any withdrawal from Donbass, insisted Ukraine was holding the line and even winning, and the Europeans backed him. Later, a story circulated that Trump had given Zelensky an ultimatum: accept the 28 points or lose U.S. intelligence and weapons support. I said at the time that this was a mistake. The Ukrainians would simply call the bluff, and they did. The supposed deadline passed, weapons and intelligence support continued, now laundered through Europe, and no one in the media talks about that ultimatum anymore. Kyiv learned that Trump's threats are flexible. Moscow learned that Washington cannot or will not bring its proxy to heel. When Russia, growing impatient with this theater, sent a memo asking what progress Trump had made in delivering on his Alaska promises, The Americans responded by arranging another call between Trump and Putin. Once again, Trump assured Putin he would get Zelensky to agree. The next day, he met Zelensky. The U.S. media themselves admit that the meeting turned ugly. Voices were raised. Maps were thrown. In the end, it was not Zelensky who yielded, but Trump, who accepted a ceasefire on the existing lines and canceled the Budapest summit he himself had proposed. Then came sanctions coordinated by the Treasury and Scott Bessent. Russia did not bend. Instead, Moscow kept fighting and started achieving major breakthroughs on the front lines. Witkoff met with Dietrich and produced a refined version of the 28 points. Now, in Florida, the Americans tried again to move Kyiv. Again, Zelensky refused. And once again, the Europeans lined up behind him. From Moscow's viewpoint, then, Kushner and Witkoff are coming to Moscow empty-handed. They have no Ukrainian concessions to offer, no European flexibility to present, and only a history of failed promises behind them. European backing stiffens Kiev's defiance. Zelensky himself, even as his negotiators were sweating in Florida, flew to France to meet Emmanuel Macron, an encounter full of smiles and warm gestures. This is key. The French, like their German, British, and European Commission counterparts, show zero embarrassment about the massive corruption scandals in Kyiv. They simply embrace Zelensky, pose for photos, and reaffirm support. This sends two signals. First, to Zelensky's opponents in Kiev, those who managed to push out his powerful chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, and might be tempted to move against Zelensky himself. It says, Europe still backs him. Do not expect Brussels or Paris to support a palace coup. That alone dampens any attempt to use the corruption scandal to remove Zelensky. Second, it reassures Zelensky personally. He can defy the Americans on territory, NATO membership, and the size and structure of Ukraine's army, because he knows that the French, the Germans, the British, and the EU institutions are still politically all in on him. As for the corruption scandal itself, whether it was triggered by U.S. intelligence, some European services, or, as I still suspect, Zelensky's own opponents in Kiev, it is symptomatic of a broader crisis of confidence. As the front collapses and the fantastical propaganda about Ukrainian victories loses credibility, all the old oligarchic networks scramble to secure what wealth they can before the end. That is why there is so much talk of a government of national unity composed of the old names, Poroshenko, Klitschko, Tymoshenko, and so on. Such a government would not change Ukraine's political direction. It would merely change which group of insiders gets to skim the remaining Western funds. Critically, none of these potential successors, not the Speaker of Parliament, not Tymoshenko, not Klitschko, not Poroshenko, not even General Zaluzhny, would alter the core Ukrainian positions. Every one of them would refuse to withdraw from Donbass, refuse to abandon NATO membership, refuse to amend the constitution. The West keeps floating the idea of better partners in Kyiv, but there is no faction willing or able to accept Russia's minimal, clearly stated conditions. Zaluzhny, as the West's insurance policy, one of these supposed alternatives, Zaluzhny, now Ukraine's ambassador to London, recently had a piece published under his name in the Daily Telegraph. As my colleague Alex Christoforou has pointed out, anyone reading it can see that it was not written by Zaluzhny himself, but by someone embedded in the British state or security apparatus. London has long treated Zaluzhny as its insurance policy in case Zelensky becomes unusable. The article is revealing it concedes that the Ukrainian offensives of 2023 failed. It admits that 2023 and 2024 were difficult years. But after a few grudging admissions, it reverts to the usual formula. Ukraine can still achieve victory, the war can still be won, but only if the West commits more, and if a freeze can be achieved on the current lines, giving Kyiv time to rebuild and rearm. In plain language, this is just another version of General Kellogg's frozen conflict formula, dressed up as realism. So, once again, there is no serious faction in Kyiv prepared to accept the loss of Donbass, drop NATO membership, and transform Ukraine into a genuinely neutral state. The entire political class is locked into a maximalist, suicidal course that the West itself encouraged. Russia's negotiating position strong, patient, and backed by the battlefield. If Kushner and Witkoff expect to arrive in Moscow and kick off a negotiation on terms that differ significantly from what Putin and Trump previously discussed in Alaska, they are likely to be disappointed. Russia has made clear that it considers the 28 points a basis for discussion, not a binding framework, and that any new proposals that deviate significantly from that starting point will be rejected. Russia has also made clear that it will not stop fighting just because talks begin. Putin has already said that any formal negotiations with Washington must be led by the Russian Foreign Ministry. Lavrov will choose the chief negotiator, probably Ryabkov, though it could be someone else. The talks will be strictly bilateral, Russia and the United States. Parallel talks with Kyiv may continue. The Istanbul channel led by Medinsky nominally still exists, but these are secondary. The real decisions will be made between Moscow and Washington, just as they were between Washington and Hanoi or Washington and the Taliban. But there is a crucial difference. In Vietnam and Afghanistan, the U.S. military had a large, openly deployed presence. The North Vietnamese and the Taliban knew that the essential objective was to make the Americans leave. Once that happened, they could shape events in Saigon or Kabul. The negotiations in Paris and Doha were part of the process of arranging that exit. In Ukraine, the United States is deeply involved, supplying weapons, intelligence, and targeting data, but does not have a major overt troop presence. Russia does not need to force the Americans out. It simply has to continue grinding down the Ukrainian army. Washington is only half in, and half in is not enough to save Kiev from a determined industrial-scale Russian campaign. That is why, from Moscow's point of view, negotiations are not a lifeline, but a potential bonus. Talks can proceed. Russia will keep advancing. The longer the talks drag on, the weaker Ukraine becomes, and the greater Russia's leverage. Think of the pattern described brilliantly by Catalin the Contemplator in a recent Substack piece reviewing U.S. negotiations with North Korea, North Vietnam, and the Taliban. In each case, Washington began by dismissing the enemy's demands, then gradually, under military and political pressure, ended up accepting almost everything the other side had asked for at the start. The same dynamic would emerge here, except that Russia, unlike the Taliban or North Vietnam, is a major power in its own right, with escalation dominance and a vast industrial base. Could the United States try to break the pattern through escalation? Of course. In Vietnam, it bombed Hanoi and expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos. In Afghanistan, it dropped the mother of all bombs and tried to intensify airstrikes. None of that changed the final outcome. In Ukraine, an attempted escalation, longer-range missiles, more NATO advisors, perhaps even some form of limited no-fly zone in western Ukraine would meet Russian counter-escalation. Moscow has been clear it will not allow a NATO victory on its borders. The battlefield, cauldrons, collapse, and Russian momentum. The real clock is not diplomatic, but military. Even Western think tanks like the Institute for the Study of War now admit that November was the second fastest month of Russian advance since Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022. The fastest was October 2024. That alone tells you how quickly the front is shifting. Russian operations around Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are particularly instructive. For weeks, the Ministry of Defense published detailed daily updates accompanied by the now familiar interviews with captured Ukrainian soldiers. Then, suddenly, the reports fell silent on this sector. Each time, we have seen this pattern before, Kyiv being a notable example. It has signaled that the battle is essentially over and Russian troops are consolidating control. The last report spoke of Russian forces advancing in southern and central Mirnograd, clearing the Dinas microdistrict in northern Pokrovsk, and entering Hrshin. In practice, Russian control over Pokrovsk has existed for about a month. Remaining fighting, there has been a mopping up exercise, eliminating pockets of Ukrainian troops left behind while the main force retreated to Mirnograd. Those in Mirnograd are now surrounded and facing collapse. Parallel advances are underway to the north and east. Russia has cleared most of Shakov, reportedly pushed into Sofivka, and continues its pressure towards key villages like Kucheriv Yar and Zoloda Niva and surrounding settlements, while moving on Rodinsky, Belitsky, and other nodes. Taken together, Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Shakove, Sofivka, Rodinsky, Belitsky, and so on form one arm of a western pincer. The eastern arm runs through Chasiv Yar towards Klyanovy, close to the important town of Drushkivka. Klyanovy lies deep inside what were Ukrainian defensive lines east of the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk-Kostiantynivka agglomeration. The Russians have now announced control of Klyonov, meaning they are pressing directly towards Drushkivka, a town of some 50,000 people that sits between Kostiantynivka and Kramatorsk. Look at the map and the logic becomes obvious. Once Pokrovsk and Mirnograd fall, and the villages to their north are mopped up, Russian troops from the west will be in position to press towards Kostiantynivka. From the east, forces advancing from Chasiv Yar via Klyanovy towards Drushkivka will threaten the same area. The result will be an encirclement, a new cauldron around Kostiantynivka and its main supply routes. Putin was recently briefed by the Russian general commanding in this sector, who said he expected Kostiantynivka to fall by mid-December. Putin cautioned him not to rush. That exchange tells us two things. First, the Russian leadership is confident that the fall of Kostiantynivka is a matter of time, not speculation. Second, it prefers a methodical, low-casualty advance to a reckless dash. Kostiantynivka will not be the last cauldron. There is already a developing cauldron around Siversk, another around Kupiansk, a worsening crisis around Huliaipol, where Russian forces are cutting supply roads and pushing into the town, and still more pressure points further south. Ultimately, the largest cauldron of all could enfold the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk cluster, the core of Ukraine's eastern military infrastructure. Here we see a crucial shift in Russian operational philosophy. Earlier in the war, Moscow often used a chess game approach, outflanking cities, cutting supply lines, leaving corridors for Ukrainian troops to withdraw, and then occupying towns once defenders had retreated. This minimized Russian casualties but preserved large Ukrainian formations for future fights. Now the approach has changed. Supply routes are cut, but escape corridors are closed. The goal is not simply to capture cities, but to trap and destroy Ukrainian brigades in place, to break the backbone of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine. Russia is now strong enough and Ukraine weak enough for this strategy to be viable. It will take months, but it will not take years. As each cauldron closes and each pocket of Ukrainian forces is destroyed or captured, Kyiv will have fewer trained soldiers, fewer intact brigades, and less capacity to man any future line. At the same time, Russia is hitting Ukraine's rear. A major drone and missile strike on Kiev 3 days ago appears to have penetrated Ukrainian air defenses with ease. Russian sources, including TASS, now speak of 80% of Ukraine's energy system being either inoperative or critically damaged. Whatever the exact figure, it is clear that Ukraine's power grid is in deep crisis. The combination of battlefield encirclements and infrastructure collapse is devastating. Diplomacy, running behind the war. Add all this up, collapsing front lines, emerging cauldrons, an army being ground into dust, a failing energy grid, and Europeans struggling to push through a 140 billion package secured on frozen Russian assets. A plan now running into serious legal and political obstacles. On top of that, the Ukrainian political system is consumed by corruption, scandals, and elite infighting, yet remains utterly unwilling to change the basic course. Under these conditions, any attempt to negotiate a settlement with Russia is not just late, it may be too late. Talks that emulate Paris or Doha, plenary sessions, working groups, drafting committees, could take years. Ukraine does not have years. Washington therefore faces an uncomfortable choice. Either accept that any negotiations will play out under conditions of steadily worsening Ukrainian weakness and growing Russian leverage, or refuse to negotiate at all and watch the military outcome unfold. Rubio's refusal to go to Moscow suggests that the U.S. establishment is deeply divided and perhaps leaning towards the second option: no meaningful negotiation, lots of posturing, and a hope that something, anything, changes the trajectory. The deep state in Washington, the Senate, and the Europeans remain adamantly hostile to conceding defeat. They still fantasize about containing or isolating Russia, even as reality moves in the opposite direction. For Moscow, this is not a problem. If Kushner and Witkoff come asking for negotiations, Russia can agree. If the talks proceed, time and momentum will favor Russia. If they collapse, the Russian army will keep doing what it is already doing, advancing steadily, destroying Ukrainian formations, and reshaping the strategic map of Eastern Europe. Either way, it is Russia that now holds the initiative on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. That is the hard, uncomfortable truth behind all the noise. The West spent years arming, financing, and politically inflating a regime in Kyiv that refused any realistic compromise. It encouraged maximalist ambitions, fantasized about strategic defeat for Russia, and ignored every warning from Moscow. Now, when the cost of that arrogance is coming due, it has nothing meaningful to offer. No credible concessions, no coherent strategy, no united leadership. Russia, by contrast, has clarity of objective, unity of command, and the patience to let battlefield reality do the talking. In any serious negotiation, those are the qualities that decide who dictates terms and who has to live with them.